Dear Lord, I'm so grateful that we're so able to make it here, be able to worship you. There's just so many people in the world who just aren't able to just gather and have this freedom, Lord, and I'm so grateful for that tonight. I pray as we open up your word that our hearts will be prepared to hear whatever you want us to hear.
All right, welcome to Refuge. Good to see y'all. We're going through the life of Moses. So we're in the book of Exodus. If you want to turn to Exodus chapter 11, that's where we're going to be starting tonight. And what we've been looking at is the plight of God's chosen people. He promised to make Abraham to a great nation. And in that promise, he promised also, he told them that they would be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. And so we're at the end of that 400 years, and tonight we're going to see that God is bringing the final deliverance. He's going to bring them to that land. He's going to make that promise known. But one thing stands in the way. They've been in this land of Egypt for 400 years. They've become slaves, and the leader of that world, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, is refusing to allow them to leave. So God has told Moses, he will let you go, but I'm going to have to compel him to let you go. I'm going to have to kind of make it uncomfortable for him. We'll start out small, and it will get big, and until he lets you go. And when he lets you go, he's not only going to say, I guess you can go. He's going to drive you out of the land. So tonight we're going to see that the judgment of God and how it brings deliverance for the Israelites. So last week we looked at the first 9 judgments, or we commonly refer to them as the plagues, that were increasingly worse and more devastating to the land of Egypt. It started out with things that were irritating and uncomfortable and problematic, and then it turned out to be things that were devastating financially and economically to the nation, devastating to their well-being, to their health. And tonight we see God's final judgment. And so, as we look at Exodus chapter 11, the first thing we're going to see is how God declares this final judgment. So, the declaration of the final judgment in chapter 11. So, the first thing we see is God has, as we've seen all throughout this, God starts off by telling Moses what he's going to do, and Moses and Aaron become his spokesman. Moses and Aaron become the voice of God to Pharaoh, the voice of God to the people of Israel. So let's read verses 1 through 3 here. Now the Lord said to Moses, one more plague. So there's been 9. One more plague. This is the last one. One more plague I will bring on Pharaoh in Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. So God's making it known to Moses, this is it. We've been through a whole lot of steps. This is the step which will bring your freedom, which will bring your deliverance and your release. Verse 2, speak now in the hearing of the people, that each man may ask from his neighbor. So each of the Israelites may ask of the Egyptians that they interact with, and each woman from her neighbor for articles of silver and articles of gold. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So this conversation between Moses and God actually took place, in conjunction with the events that we saw in chapter 10, and it took place before that last conversation between Moses and Pharaoh. The better way to start off verse 1 was God had previously said to Moses. God had previously told Moses, and that's what the Hebrew scholars on this say that's kind of the way this is phrased here. God had told him in the past and some time ago. So this wasn't a follow-up where the plague of darkness comes and Pharaoh and Moses have this very terse interaction. Pharaoh says, if you come in my presence again, I'll kill you. And Moses says, you'll never see me again. Don't worry. Okay, so that's how chapter 10 ends. This conversation and this instruction came before that. And so it's leading up to this last judgment of God. God knew that Pharaoh would harden his heart. God knew Pharaoh would be stubborn and not allow them to go. And so prior to the plague of darkness, he gave Moses this instruction. At some time prior to that, we don't know exactly the timeline. But God assured that this was the final event. At the culmination of this event, Israel would be a free people. They would not only be allowed to leave, but they would be almost driven from land. Go, get out of here. Okay, kind of like you've overstayed your welcome somewhere. Please leave. Okay, thank you for coming. You may go now. You don't have to go home. You can't stay here. Okay, whatever, however you phrase that. So God had given to Moses the details, and he was supposed to tell Pharaoh. So let's look at the conversation that Pharaoh and Moses have over this. God's warning to Pharaoh in verse 4. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, "The Lord, thus says the Lord." Now here's the warning. This is again in conjunction with their conversation after the 9th plague. And Pharaoh hardens his heart and he says, "No, I'm not going to let you go. I'll let a few of you go. You have to leave this group of people. You have to leave the herds. You can go. I'll let you go to somewhere different, whatever." But it's always on Pharaoh's terms. God says, "No, you're going to let them go." I'm going to do.
You need to do. Yeah, I was about to say that. You need to do.
And I think it does that almost once.
It does that every week. I remember. Yeah, I think.
At the same point.
Yeah.
We need a new Trey. He calls you out every time.
I know, exactly. You do that every week too. Are we going to replace you?
I don't know.
Okay.
Who are you going to find to replace me? University, maybe. Mercy can replace me.
I don't know if you're replaceable, Brett. Okay, so let's go back to what the Bible said here. Interrupted by Siri here. Okay, so Moses said, "Thus says the Lord." And so here's the warning. About midnight, I'm going to come into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. So Pharaoh has said, this plague of darkness, fine, I'll let you, I'll let you go on my terms, and you'll return on my terms. And Moses said, "No, we're only doing things according to God's terms." And so he says, here's what's going to happen. One night, firstborn of all the land of Egypt shall die. And it will impact everyone, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl, who is behind the millstones. All the firstborn of the cattle as well. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as there shall never be again. But against any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, so that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these your servants will come down to me and bow themselves before me, saying, "Go out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will go out." And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. So again, this conversation is kind of a whole part of that prior conversation that's put here because it's leading up to this final judgment of God. But he's saying there's only two drastic differences. The drastic difference between the land of Egypt and the area where the Israelites are living. There will be devastation in the land of Egypt, in the area where the Egyptians are living. There will be peace and tranquility. A dog won't even bark. in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are. Here's what's going to happen. One night at midnight, God will come through the land, and the firstborn of every family and all the livestock will die. No one is spared. No one's safe from it. It doesn't matter your status. It doesn't matter what your education level is. It doesn't matter what your bank account looks like, what your job is, what political party you're part of. Everyone will be impacted by this. It doesn't matter who you voted for king. You don't have to vote. You'll be impacted.
That's the scariest part, because it says all of Egypt, implying that it wasn't just in Memphis, the capital city where Pharaoh lived. It would have also been in Thebes and Tanis and Heliopolis, all the cities. It would have been in all the small villages. This seems to indicate that it would have been in all the land under the jurisdiction of this Pharaoh.
Yeah, I don't know if it was a total political boundaries kind of thing, or if it was in the immediate land of Egypt. We don't know for
Perhaps
sure.
it could have just been the capital city of Memphis.
Yeah, it could have just been that immediate area, because that's been the location and the interaction of the plagues. So it's interesting here. God has Moses tell him there will be a great cry from all of Egypt. There'll be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt. They'll be heard from the palace to the homes of the servants. There will be a great cry, because it will impact everyone. God was essentially defined this night as the worst night in Israel's history. The worst night that had ever happened, the worst night that would ever happen in history. Or not Israel. In Israel.
They know that Holocaust history.
Yeah.
Base.
And so it's in the history of Egypt. No night had ever been this bad. No night would ever be this bad for the nation of Egypt. It was one of those days that will impact them as a nation forever. And he says there will be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before and never be again. It's interesting, because now the cry will be coming from Egypt. Earlier, the cry was coming from Israel because of the oppression by Egypt. And so God is taking the oppression that they put on the Israelites and turning it against them. Whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. Egypt definitely falls into the person Israel category. So as Moses left this conversation, that last little phrase there is kind of unexpected, isn't it? Moses left in hot anger. He was ticked off. He was fuming mad. What would get Moses so upset in this conversation, in this interaction?
Because Pharaoh has gone through so much, he's seen all this, and yet he still won't heed Moses' warnings.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's fine if somebody's stupid. Go ahead and be stupid. I don't care. But when your stupid starts to impact the whole nation, because you're stupid, because you're stubborn,
You're prideful.
the pride kicks in. The lack of willingness to submit to anything other than yourself. Moses sees the devastation that Pharaoh's stubbornness and pride are bringing. And he's angry. He's angry because there's no need for this. There's no need for it, but the stubbornness of Pharaoh. Because of Pharaoh's decision, thousands of Egyptians probably will die that one night. So Pharaoh's response is at the end of this chapter, And essentially, kind of the same thing we saw throughout the rest of the plagues. Pharaoh's response was exactly what you would expect. He hardened his heart. He refused to let them go. He got even more stubborn about it.
To the point where he threatened to kill Moses, he returned.
Yeah. And so, unfortunately, Pharaoh thinks he's delivering bad news for Israel, but really the bad news is for Egypt. And the bad news and the devastation is about to come on Egypt. Pharaoh's refusal to let him go doesn't stop God moving forward with his plan. It doesn't stop God at all from doing what he had promised he would do. So, as we saw at the end of chapter 10, Pharaoh threatened Moses' life, as Trey said. Pharaoh threatened his life, and he said, "Never come back into my presence again." And Moses replied, "I'm not going to need to after you face what God is about to do. You won't need to see me again." So let's jump ahead and let's look at the deliverance of Israel at the end of chapter 12 and see how God brought about their deliverance. Let's look at these events here. So I'm jumping to the end of chapter 12. Let's look at God's power in verses 29 and 30. It came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, and he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead.
There's a nagging question that's at me right here. Why did the Creator decide to kill every firstborn in Egypt except for the one firstborn who actually deserved all of this?
You talking about Pharaoh?
Yeah.
I don't know what God's thought process was or decision making process was in that. That's a good question to set right now for him.
I'll make sure to ask
I think it's like, it's a so this is on you, dude. Like, I gave you 9 chances.
In some ways, the surviving the plague is worse than seeing the devastation that your decision, your stubbornness has caused. Is almost worse than being a victim.
This is ultimately on Pharaoh. As I said, God gave the guy 9 chances. Like, dude, all you gotta do is let these people go.
And none of those 9 chances were particularly lethal.
Oh, they were lethal. They destroyed, Egypt's economy was wrecked by that.
Yeah. So let's keep going here. You guys talk at Chick-fil-A.
God have mercy on us.
So that's what happened. The firstborn died. The first from Pharaoh's house to the servant's house to the prisoner's household. There was someone dead in every household. Think about that. As you drive up and down, you drive through a subdivision, one dead house. That's devastating. That carries a lot of weight. Look, I want to look back at Exodus chapter 4. Before Moses even met with God the first time. Not with God. Before Moses, okay. I was wild there. Okay, breath. And before Moses even met with Pharaoh the first time, God had given him the big picture to share with Pharaoh. Let's look at verse 20. Let me read verses 22 and 23 of Exodus 4 for you. For he even returned to Egypt. God said to Moses, verse 22, "You shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me." This is God speaking to Pharaoh. Let him go. Let my son go. Let Israel go that they may serve me. but you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your first. So God gives that warning and that foreshadowing of what is yet to come before the first thing even happens, before the staff turns into a snake, before the water turns into blood. God has already laid out what the problem is, what will happen. So the question is, why did God kill the firstborn in every family? What did Pharaoh done to God? He had attempted to kill the firstborn of God's chosen one. God describes Israel as my firstborn. He had attempted not this Pharaoh, but as a leader and as by.
I mean, there's no indication that any of this stopped by the time Moses said it.
Yeah, so it may still be going on, but definitely at the time of Moses' birth, there was a decree in the land to kill every baby boy of the people of Israel. And so God's saying, you've attempted to take, or you've taken the life of my precious firstborn, and that's what will happen to you. God made it clear that he is far above Pharaoh in authority and far above Pharaoh in power. And no matter how confident and defiant Pharaoh is, God is a king and ruler. He's Pharaoh's king. He's Pharaoh's leader. And Egypt had, as I mentioned, it attempted to kill baby boys. So God gave him that warning. So jumping down to the next section, God keeps his promise. God keeps his promise. So he's promised to deliver Israel. Let's look at verse. Well, I'm going to look at something in Genesis in a minute here. Hundreds of years earlier, God had made a promise to Abraham, and I want to jump to that real quick. In Genesis chapter 15, God had made a promise to Abraham. In that promise, God said in Genesis 15:13, God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. This is in the process of God promising Abraham the land. Your strangers will be descendants in a land, or be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. So God had promised. God had promised not only would they let the people go, but they would drive them out. So let's see what happens in this night at midnight in verse 31. So Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, you and the son of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said, not as I have said. Always before it was, I will let you go on my terms. But now go out on your terms. Go out on God's terms. Go out as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds, and as you have said, and go and bless me also. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. Let's get rid of the Israelites. We need to let them go. Otherwise, this is not going to stop. Jumping down to verse 35. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they would let them have their requests. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So God kept his promise. What did he promise to Abraham hundreds and hundreds of years, about 500 years earlier? What did he promise to Abraham?
He will judge the nation.
He will judge the nation that enslaves it. Well, he promised them many things. You'll be live in a nation that is another land for 400 years. You'll be oppressed there. I will deliver you, and when I deliver you, you will come out with many possessions. That's not typically how a slave leaves that kind of a role. That's not typically how they wind up exiting. So what did God promise? what was his promise to them? First of all, every Israelite, every single Israelite will be delivered. That's what happened. Promised they would leave with many possessions. That's what happened. He told them, when you leave, you will take all of your livestock and all of your herds with you. But as Pharaoh said, take it, everything. Take it all and go. He promised them, not only will you leave, Pharaoh will drive you out. That's what happened. So let's jump down to verse 37 and look at how God delivers Israel. So in verse 37 it says, now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from the children. Jumping down to verse 40, now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. So I want you to picture this. They've lived in this land for 430 years. They've never left. They've never gone outside of this land. Now it gives us the path of their deliverance, the path that they're taking. From here, they went through this town, and that's how they exited the land on this night. The whole nation of Egypt is in an uproar, is in despair because someone in every household is dead, and they're driving the people out. And what do the people do? They leave. They went from Ramses through Succoth. So it gives us the route. They are leaving as free people for the first time in generations. The first time in their lives, this group of people is free. They have no slave master. There are no bricks to make. For the first time, they're free.
They lived happily ever after.
And everything went great. And it tells us that there were 600,000 men, plus children and plus women. And so that's how they calculate that they're probably in the neighborhood of about 2 million people that left. And so they entered the promised land, or the land of Egypt, they entered the land of Egypt as an extended family group of about 70 or so. A couple 400 years later, they leave as a nation of 2 million people. So those are kind of the overriding events that took place, the devastation for Egypt, the deliverance for Israel, how God had promised that, how God was working in that. Let's look at the significance of the Passover, because in this, it's interesting, as you read the events surrounding this final judgment of Egypt, there's actually more emphasis put on the significance of the details rather than just the events. It didn't take us too long to read through almost every bit of the events that took place, but there's a whole lot of significance tied to it. First thing that we'll read about here is in chapter 12. One of the first instructions each household was given was, you must choose a lamb. Your family must choose a lamb. Let's read verse 1 of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Verse 5, your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old, and you may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. This event was so significant, it became the beginning of their year in their religious calendar. It became, as a brand new nation, God says, I'm starting a new year. This is a brand new start for you as a nation, and this is the beginning of it. This is ground zero, and we're moving forward from here. This is month 1 of my eternal plan as a nation as you head back to the land of Egypt. So, what's the instruction? Each family is to take a lamb, each household to take a lamb on the 10th day of the month. I love this because it's by household. This isn't a generational thing. This isn't just for the grown-ups. This is a family thing. This is a community focused event and deliverance that's happening. So what did they need to do? They needed to find an unblemished male lamb. They had to keep it from the 10th to the 14th. They kept it, and during that time they would inspect it just to make sure this is an ideal lamb, a lamb without spot, a lamb without blemish. And then on the 14th at twilight, which is somewhere between noon and 6, so about the 3 o'clock time frame, is probably the midpoint of twilight. So right about that time, the whole nation of Israel is to kill the lamb at the same time. The whole nation. So let's look at the sacrifice. Jump down to verse 8. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Now you shall eat in this manner, with your loins girded, with your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste, for it is the Lord's Passover. So you notice the pace here. It's a hurried pace. It's like this is not a leisurely time point in your nation's history, because there is an open window of opportunity for you to leave this land, and you need to be ready. From the moment that you get the word from Pharaoh, you know how Pharaoh is. He doesn't really keep his word. He's going to change his mind pretty soon. And so you need to be ready to go. So they had to eat it all that night, or if there was any left over, they weren't to save till the next day because they weren't going to be there the next day. How cool is that? You're somewhere horrible that you dread, and God said, you're not even going to spend the night here tonight. Yes, tonight. Free tonight. I don't even have to save leftovers till tomorrow. He said, don't save anything. If there's leftover meat, burn it on the fire. You don't have to try to save it. He said, I want you to eat unleavened bread because there's no time for your dough to rise. This is a meal you will eat in haste. I want you to eat ready to go. He said, have your sandals on your feet, have your staff in your hand, have your bags ready, be ready to go. As soon as someone says go, you need to be like walking out the door. As soon as it's time. We saw the devastation that took place in Egypt among the Egyptians. And there's a contrast that God gave of what it was like in the area where the Israelites were living. Tranquility and peace. Because God delivered. Let's look at how the Lamb delivers. How did they have a whole different experience with this? Let's look at verse 21. Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families. Slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of that blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house till morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptian, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come to your houses to smite you. You shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. What was the only protection in people and death? Is that blood? It's on the door. It wasn't safe to leave the house. He said, stay in your house. Whatever you do, don't step outside. You have to stay under that protection. You have to stay there. The Egyptian population didn't have that blood protecting them. They did not have this obedience and this trust in God to follow through. That blood is what saved them. Verse 24, he says, God makes it clear. This is something that's ongoing. This is a truth I want you to understand. I want you to understand it. I want your children to understand it. I want your great-grandchildren to understand it. All generations from here on out, I want to understand. It carries a lot of significance, way more significance than any of the other judgments that God performed, because God wanted to reveal something about his character. God wanted to reveal his plan for redemption. That's what we see here. In the New Testament, we see that word redemption and redeem quite a bit. What that means is to buy something out of slavery. That's exactly what God did here. He brought them out. He purchased them out of slavery. So what was the significance of the lamb at Passover? It had to be a perfect lamb. Because that lamb died, people lived. If the lamb didn't die, people lived.
I'm familiar.
The blood provided salvation. And here's an interesting aspect of it. It wasn't the life of the lamb that saved the people. It was the death of the lamb that saved. As we look, obvious connections as you jump to the New Testament. You look at the life and ministry of Jesus and what the apostles and the New Testament has to say about Jesus. I'm going to highlight just a couple. There's so many connections here that we couldn't even touch on. But when John the Baptist saw Jesus for the first time, he said, "Behold." What did he call him? Lamb of God, who does what? Takes away the sin of the world. What was everybody's determination of Jesus' level of guilt during his trials? I can find no fault in him. There's nothing that he has done. Romans tells us, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The Bible tells us his blood washes away our sin, and it's the only means of deliverance. As you look at the events of Jesus' crucifixion, he was crucified on Passover. Passover. These are only a couple of the pictures that God was painting of what redemption would look like. So here's what I have for you this week. Two things. First thing, I want to challenge you to read through all. We kind of skipped around and skipped some verses here, just so we could fit it all in. But read chapters 11 and 12 and look at it in context of your salvation. Look at it in context of your salvation. Secondly, take obedience to God seriously. If there's any lesson we can pull away from Pharaoh's stubbornness, it's that obedience to God matters. Immediate obedience to God matters. I guess Pharaoh ultimately obeyed God, right? He let them go. But what did it cost him in the interim? His nation.
Well, better late than never, right?
And so, what is it? What is disobedience? What is the cost of disobedience in our lives? What is the cost of us saying, "No, I'm going to do it my way, not God's way"? We need to elevate obedience to God and immediate obedience to God as a very high priority in our lives. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this account of your total control of the situation. Your faithfulness to your promise to your people. Your righteousness displayed. Sin judged. God's good. Help us to balance what it means to walk. God, as we read these chapters, I pray that you'll help us to see that Jesus' death on the cross, Jesus' sacrifice for us, wasn't some afterthought. It wasn't just a turn of events that went bad in his ministry. It was your desire to never like us and while we understand.